Hi, and welcome to the 83rd in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. Today, we are going to talk about the Republic of Turkey. We're going to finish what we discussed in the Second Republic period, and we're going to then talk about Erdoğanism and how that has transformed the Third Republic, which we are still in. The rules, for those of you who are not familiar. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing tonight. I am a layperson who is going to share my lay expertise, and I hope you guys find it enjoyable. This is a secular presentation, meaning that I try not to take political sides. That said, this topic, like all topics in the Middle Eastern history series, will be controversial, so I would appreciate if everyone's respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. What I like to say is that my class is a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I should tell you more than enough to catch you up. And if you know something, that's the 201. I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. Oh, and one point on the questions, comments, and clarifications. At the 2-hour hard stop, where whatever material I've gotten to at 9 p.m. Eastern time, if I don't get to any more, that'll be the last slide I'm on, and then I'll start next week from there. There will be a vocal Q&A, and so you can ask your questions out loud if you prefer not to put them in the chat. When I put dates below a person, those will typically be years of service if it's a political figure in that specific role that they have. And if they are a thought leader, like a philosopher or a journalist or a commentator or something like that, or they don't have a particular time in their role, those are their years of life. This is going to be recorded, so you can watch it later, just like the other 82 entries in the Middle Eastern History series. And you can watch all of those on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get updated information about any new offerings that we have. And you can also see all the other entrants in History Mostly Ancient Discussions outside of my Middle Eastern presentations. And if you want to be in the Zooms, please feel free to join our meetup. That is the meetup link below. It doesn't just cover history. It doesn't just cover my presentations on the Middle Eastern history, but all of the different history, mostly ancient discussions. You can be there and ask your questions in real time. And of course, we enjoy doing this for free, and we'll continue to do so. That said, we have premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube, which all cost a premium. So we would appreciate any donations you can give us at those two links there. All right. So when we spoke yesterday, we talked about the period of initial democratization in Turkey. And that period of initial democratization led to the arising of the Democrat Party led by Adnan Menderes. And Menderes got to a point where he had been elected for successive terms. Now, he first became prime minister in 1950, with his party winning 52% of the electoral vote. He won again in 54, to a lesser extent 57, and then things were starting to change. There was starting to be inflation. America was no longer bankrolling a lot of the major projects that he wanted to do, so he flirted with the Soviet Union, and he tried to prevent İsmet İnönü and the Republican Party from achieving power. Now, we should be clear in terms of terminology. The Democrat Party is actually more conservative than the Republican Party. The Republican Party is maybe center-right, and the Democratic Party is hard right. So when İsmet İnönü was held up in the town of Yeşilhisar, on his way to Kayseri to continue his campaigning for the role of becoming prime minister once again of Turkey. He got on television and more or less threatened Adnan Menderes that if he did not respect the tenets of the democracy, if he didn't respect the rule of law and the ability of competing political parties to assemble, the military might take action. And in fact, the population became increasingly perturbed by what was going on. In early 1960, you began to have large-scale protests throughout the country, especially in the major cities where the Republican Party was dominant, like Istanbul, like Ankara, like Izmir. And these large protests were met with increasing violence from the police at Menderes's direction. So the military decided to follow through on one of the 6 points of Kemalism, inkılapçılık, or devrimcilik, meaning revolutionism. And this revolutionism was the idea that if it were the case that the Turkish Republic was veering away from the 6 arrows, the altı ok of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, that the military should be the guardians of that democracy, of that Turkish Republican project. And so Alparslan Türkeş, who we're going to see a lot more of today, and a number of other military commanders decided to launch a coup and remove Menderes from power in May of 1960. Türkeş gets on the radio and announces that Cemal Gürsel is going to take power, and that Adnan Menderes will be arrested. And in fact, he is arrested with a number of other leaders like Celal Bayar of the Democrats Party, and they are brought to Yasyada, or Yasi Island, in the Aegean Sea, where they are held for trial. That trial commences in October of 1960 and doesn't finish until quite a bit later. It handed down 15 death sentences, of which only a few were actually carried out, one of them being the death sentence of Adnan Menderes himself, who was executed by the military government, led by Cemal Gürsel. The argument was that he was acting against the Republican interest of Turkey, against the interest of the state, and of course that he was going to meet with Nikita Khrushchev later in 1960, which would have been a violation of Turkey's pro-Western stance that it had acquired during the Cold War. I want to spend a few seconds on that last one. The Turkish military cared a lot about Turkey's political posturing. Alparslan Türkeş especially had the view that Turkey was a besieged country. All of the countries around Turkey were either hostile or had the potentiality of being hostile. You had the Soviet Union in the east, which had already pushed for acquiring Turkish territories under the reign of Stalin. You had Bulgaria in the northwest that had made claims towards the northwestern portion of Turkey, which was a densely populated area around Edirne. You had Greece, with whom Turkey had had numerous conflicts. Most recently, in 1955, there were the Istanbul pogroms over the increasingly frictious issue of Cyprus. And then, of course, on its southern borders, you had Syria and Iraq, which in 1960 were both ruled by autocratic Arab nationalist regimes. If we remember, in 1960, Iraq was controlled by Abdul Karim Qasim, who was aligned more with the Soviet Union than with the West. And we had the unification of Egypt and Syria as a United Arab Republic controlling Syria, meaning that Syria was pointedly either pro-Soviet or at best neutral with regards to the Cold War. And Iran, Turkey's last ally, was Turkey's last neighbor, was a possible ally in the Baghdad Pact, but as Baghdad had withdrawn from the Baghdad Pact, it remained to be seen whether Iran could be counted upon as a functional ally, especially given that there had been a coup to reinstate Mohammad Reza Shah only 7 years previously. So the view of Turkish and a lot of other people was that Turkey could not risk to compromise any of its political orientation in the wider schema, because every country around them, every country that bordered them, was a country that was looking to tear Turkey apart. And this goes back to the trauma of World War I, where the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. And not only that, the Ottoman Empire was complicit with the Treaty of Sèvres In the increasing dismemberment of Anatolia, there was going to be an Italian colony, a British colony, a French colony within the territory of Turkey. Greece was going to annex certain parts of the country, and the Turkish area would have been a rump state on the Black Sea. But for Atatürk fighting off all of these different forces in the Turkish War of Independence, Turkey would have been effectively taken apart by all of its neighbors on the outside. And so despite the fact that we've moved 50 years in the future, 40 to 50 years in the future, this mentality was still quite common among the military. In fact, many of the people and that older group, like Cemal Gürsel, were individuals that had served in some capacity during the Turkish War of Independence, and therefore still had the memory of trying to retake Turkey from domination. Now, I have a question here about whether the Democrats were akin to blue dog conservatives. I would say that the reason that we talk about blue dog conservatives, we talk about blue dog conservative Democrats in the United States is because Democrats are generally liberal, but they're not progressive if they're trying to campaign in among those groups. The Democrats in Turkey are a conservative party. I think the best way to think about them is as the American Republicans. And their electoral base actually matches. So the Democratic Party primarily gets votes from rural voters who are traditional and religious, because the Democrat Party is going to relax some of the standards on religion. For example, they allowed the adhan to be given in Arabic as opposed to requiring it in Turkish. The Diyanet was given more liberty. People were free to build new mosques in a way that they weren't during the Republican administration. And the other major group, the one that funded the Democrat Party, were wealthy industrialists, landowners, and other forms of people with capital, because they wanted the ability to engage in laissez-faire capitalism. Conversely, the Republican People's Party, the CHP, the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, was in a way very similar to the American Democrats, in that their primary coalition is made of educated urbanite citizens and people who, as a general matter, want a secular government. The one exception is, of course, that the military seems to be along the Republican People's Party, as opposed to being aligned with the Democrat Party, mostly on the principle of ensuring the survival of the republic. So the next thing that we sort of talked about last time was the Gastarbeiter, or the guest worker program. And this sort of feeds into the problem that Europe was suffering in the 1950s and 60s, especially those countries in Europe that had been subject to the pressures of World War II. And World War II was particularly difficult on Germany, in that significant portions of the country were bombed, and a significant percentage of the young people, the young men of that country, were thrown into the grinder of war, be they either executed in large-scale civilian killings like the Holocaust, or if they were simply soldiers or guards or some other functionary, they got caught up in the actual war itself. And so you had a massive labor shortage in Germany. The initial places to look were Italy and later Spain, and that happened during the 1950s. But increasingly, Germans who were pushing back on including Turkey, usually citing that there would be too much cultural difference, began to give way. And Cemal Gürsel, during the period of the military rule, following the successful coup d'etat, signed an agreement with Germany to participate in its Gastarbeiter program, in its guest worker program, and you began to have Turkish populations in Germany. And there's a few interesting things to point out here. With the arrival of large Turkish populations in Germany, and to a smaller extent in France, in the Netherlands, in other European countries that have been devastated by World War II, whereas Turkey had not been, you had a large amount of Kulturkampf, if we can say this, cultural struggle. This is because the Turks who went on these Gastarbeiter programs were almost exclusively from rural areas. These were traditional people, and they were sort of deracinated in a way from everything that they had known and thrown into this other climate where the people were not willing to accept the possibility of their long-term assimilation. There was a strong sense in Germany that Turks would never become Germans. And in the first generation, perhaps the Turks who felt like they would probably go back to Germany, and the Germans who sort of thought that the Gastarbeiter would go back to their countries of origin, they sort of accepted that this assimilation wouldn't happen because they were going to go back. But eventually it became the case that when you had millions of guest workers and they began to settle and bring their families, that a return to their home countries was just not going to happen. In fact, in 1983, when you get to the Third Republic, Turgut Özal, who was the prime minister at the time, signed the Foreigners Repatriation Incentives Law, which coordinated with Germany for the possibility of allowing these Gastarbeiter to return back to Turkey and to live their lives there. But of the over 1.5 million Turks that were living in Germany at the time, now it's over 3 million, only 200,000 of them came back to Turkey, which should show how established the Turks were in Germany and how they considered their lives better for having been in Germany. In fact, a lot of Gastarbeiter have written that what they saw in Germany was shocking to them in a positive way. They were surprised by the quantity of hospitals, of schools, of functional infrastructure, of non-corrupt politicians, of all of these kinds of elements that really didn't exist in Turkey. And to the extent that there were political parties in Turkey that represented that change, they advocated for them. So you end up seeing this dichotomy of voting patterns where the Gastarbeiter, who are still Turkish citizens, will vote for conservative parties in Turkey that they think are modernizing the country, while they will vote in German elections, to the extent that they're permitted to vote in German elections, for left-wing parties like the Social Democrats, or even more Die Links, or the Greens. In fact, the overwhelming majority of Turkish German politicians are left-leaning politicians in Germany. Now, there's a question about, in terms of demographics, what percentage of those in Turkey or Germany are Turkish German descent? To be fair, there may be some intermarriage between Turks and Germans, but it's not very high. So if we're talking about Turks living in Germany, Germany has a total population today of around 85 million, of whom about 3 million are Turks. So that's about 3 to 4% of the total German population. In Turkey, the percentage of Turks that are descended from those who are Gastarbeiter is probably somewhere around 500,000, right? And yeah, so that would be your numbers. But one of the interesting things about the Turks in Germany is that, as we'll see, there are a number of repressions that Turkey goes through, especially during the Second Republic period and the Third Republic period, closer to today, actually, on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and so on. And so a lot of Turkish political figures find a home in these diasporas, either through their music or through their speeches. One particular example that I want to point out is Cem Karaca, who was afraid of returning to Turkey during the latter part of the Second Republic period. And he ended up staying for a long time in Germany. Of course, he's very famous for his music, which tended to at first be primarily in Turkish, but then he would increasingly add German words or German phrases into his Turkish songs, which sort of shows his increasing affinity for Germany in some sort of way. We also see the development in a musical sense within Germany, especially once we get into the 1990s, and there are attacks like the attack at Solingen, where Turks were burned in their houses under an arson attack from neo-Nazis, of the Turkish embrace of rap and other sorts of African American music as a representation of their inability to assimilate, their inability to express themselves, and they're beginning to be locked away almost in ghettos and enclaves where they have no real ability to progress politically. So we then see, in addition to this sort of failure to assimilate, Germany eventually changes its laws and makes it easier for Turks to assimilate and nationalize as German citizens. Although many German Turks point out that the conditions for post-Soviets, especially post-Soviet Jews, to nationalize in Germany is actually much easier than it is for the former Gastarbeiter and their children, which should say something about who Germany believes can assimilate or would assimilate. But within Germany, the Turks also have made a number of positive contributions. I spoke last time about Cem Özdemir and Uğur Şahin. Cem Özdemir is the leader of the Green Party. He was, in 2016, one of the primary German nationals to push for the recognition of the Armenian genocide as a political matter. He has been considered persona non grata within Turkey because of his frequent criticisms of the Erdoğan government and his promotion of human rights and equality before the law in both a German and a Turkish context. In most cases, he speaks as a German politician, and he doesn't speak as a Turkish citizen or ethnic Turk. And in fact, Erdoğan has been more than willing on numerous occasions to call Özdemir a so-called Turk because of his loyalty to Germany and German values. And Uğur Şahin and Özlem Türeci are a husband and wife group, and they were, as I mentioned last time, the founders of BioNTech and key researchers in that organization. BioNTech was responsible, in conjunction with Pfizer, for creating the first mRNA vaccine to the COVID virus that proliferated in 2020. So we have that as well. Now, Cem Gürsel did not want to remain a dictator forever. So starting in 1961, he began to work with İsmet İnönü, who you can see at that desk. He's the old and apparently bald, but he actually has hair on the top of his head. It's just very blonde man there. And the military leaders trusted that İnönü would be able to maintain a transition to democracy, but in the most part. But some disagreed. And so you had, as we discussed last time, the failed coup of Talat Aydemir, first in 1962, and then again in 1963, after which Aydemir was executed. And the constitution that the military created, this second constitution of 1961, created 4 different centers of power within the country that would serve as a checks and balances system against one another. The first one, of course, was the Grand National Assembly. That's the parliament system. And the Grand National Assembly includes both an executive and a legislative function. And that had been the traditional source of power. It had been the power source during İnönü's one-party rule. It had been the power source during the Democrat rule of Adnan Menderes. But they separated out the Supreme Court and gave it its own accountability and its own ability to operate outside of the confines of the Grand National Assembly, which effectively meant that it could stop laws that were immoral or against the Turkish constitution from being passed. There was also independence given to the state radio, the media, and the universities, all of the intellectual and publishing centers of the government, because all these entities were still public. You had public newspapers, public radio, public television, and so on. But all of these were operating independent of the Grand National Assembly, which meant that they could criticize them, and criticize them in a way that a significant number of people were sure to read or understand. And that would lead to public opposition to the concentration of power in the Grand National Assembly again. And of course, the military wanted to operate entirely independently of the political strictures of the Grand National Assembly, and therefore reported to no one. They would operate and, at their own recognizance, interpret whether the Turkish Republic had veered too far from the implementation desired under the 6 arrows of Kemalism, and therefore, and at that point, they would intervene and they would seek to restore the Turkish Republic. So this resulted in a very chaotic period throughout both the 60s and the 70s, as different political parties tried to gain dominance in the different spheres of power that existed. Now, within the military, they were going to remain staunchly Kemalist throughout this period. That one was not particularly under threat. But within the National Assembly, within the universities, there were certainly pushes for more and more political involvement. İnönü ruled more or less until 1965, when he lost the election to a new party, the Justice Party. But the Justice Party was in many respects a reconfiguration of the Democrat Party. It was a conservative party, and it appealed primarily to rural voters. In particular, they led with their politician Süleyman Demirel, who is often called Shepherd Sulu, because he came from the countryside and he spoke with a countryside accent, endearing him to a lot of the rural population. And he and his coalition were able to rule within the legislature for quite a long period of time, from 1965 pretty much until 1973. There were some fits and starts in there, like the 1971 memorandum coup, which we'll get to. But by and large, he was able to govern. And this prompted a significant amount of soul searching for the Republican Party, with Bülent Ecevit, one of İnönü's successors, trying to rebrand the party as a social democratic party, moving it from center to center left. There was division within the Republican Party about whether the population should move so far. And so this division within the Republican Party further made it difficult for the Republicans to stand against the Justice Party. We also have an increasing urbanization of the country, which one would think would lead to more votes being cast for the Republican Party. But many of the people who were moving to the cities were from the rural areas, and they were moving to the cities to take part in industry. So for many of them, religion was an important part of personal stabilization and personal meaning, meaning that at least for the first decade or so, they were still voting along the lines that they had in the rural communities, which was right-leaning. But eventually, the industrial workers began to become more socialist in their outlook, wanting to have labor unions and have rights as communal bargaining might have them do. And so what ends up happening is that we have this really strong leftward shift in the industrial sector, and this is echoed by the universities, where you have debate societies that begin to form, like the Fikir Kulüpleri Federation. And this kind of federation or federation brought together a number of young people who were seeing more of an example being set by the Soviet Union in terms of how Turkey should move forward, something closer to communism than the current Western alignment of the government. This made it harder and harder for Demirel to keep coalitions together. And in particular, you had the development of the Dev Genç, or the Devrimi Gençlik, meaning the revolutionary youth. This organization was effectively a communist or socialist organization that brought out the young in Turkey to fight against the increasingly stolid aristocratic system that existed in the country. And as we move into the later 1960s, we have a problem in that the Grand National Assembly, as it's currently constituted, has kept the left out, but they've also kept out the right. So on the right, you have what are called the Grey Wolves. And the Grey Wolves or Bozkurtlar, are an organization that is primarily centered around that sort of ultra-nationalist view of Alparslan Turkish that we talked about earlier, that Turkey is always under threat, that Turkey is always at siege. And so any of the enemies that could derail Turkey's foreign policy, any of the enemies that surround Turkey could take advantage of it, especially the Soviet Union, through the increasing power of the Devrimi Gençlik and other left-wing organizations. And so you began to have numerous people killing each other in the street because of these purported conflicts. Now, to say the left was sort of innocent in all this would be a misstatement. The left engaged in numerous attacks on politicians and on bureaucrats, kidnapping them from their homes. And in a claim to protect them, the Grey Wolves would attack these left-wing individuals. Probably the most famous such attack is Kanlı Pazar, or Bloody Sunday, which on 16th of February 1969, what ended up happening is that a number of left-wing protesters were physically attacked by the Grey Wolves, a number of them killed. Yeah, I think it says 2 dead, 100 wounded. And these kinds of violence in the streets made it quite clear to the military that Demirel was not controlling the situation effectively. But there were a few things that made it difficult for Demirel to control the situation effectively. The first was that every time you'd put a political coalition together, it would fall apart. And that's because many of the individual leaders from different political parties would splinter off at the first sign of disagreement, especially when they became partial to the views of either the Devrimi Gençlik or the Revolutionary Youth or the Bozkurtlar, the Grey Wolves. We then have an issue that the economy was getting increasingly bad towards the end of the 1960s, such that Demirel instituted an artificial peg, meaning that he made the Turkish lira worth more than it was officially, so that way imports would stay at the same price and Turkey would still be competitive in terms of importing everything that it needed. But the actual value of the lira had dropped by over 5 times. And so you began to have a currency black market where people were desperate to get dollars or any other foreign currency because otherwise they didn't know what they could buy on the foreign market. And you also have waves of anti-Americanism, which the military absolutely could not stand. In particular, you can see the left-wing protest against the American Sixth Fleet. And the Sixth Fleet usually anchored off the Turkish coast as part of NATO and NATO's protection of the Eastern Mediterranean. So the military absolutely did not want to offend the Americans and lose that protection that they had gotten through entrance to NATO in 1952. So in 1971, they published a memorandum and sent it to Demirel, basically telling him to get his act together, or they would do what they had to do in order to bring order to the system. And this was called the 12th of March Military Memorandum. One other thing that's worth mentioning that was addressed in the memorandum was Necmettin Erbakan. And we're going to see a bit of this politician as we move through. Erbakan was the leader of a groundswell movement that was beginning to occur. And this was a movement that threatened to break the right wing, in that the right wing had relied, up until this point, on religious conservatives and fiscal conservatives being in the same party. Erbakan wanted to split this in that he was going to create a party for religious conservatives that didn't have necessarily an economic policy, but would probably have a policy that aligned somewhat more left-leaning in terms of its economics, if anything. And that was a policy modified by the strictures of Islamism. And we've mentioned Islamism in other discussions. Islamism is the idea that there should be a theocracy, a rule by Islamic law in a modern nation state. So Erdoğan's view on creating Islam as a state religion of Turkey and having that have some kind of influence in the Turkish system was fundamentally inimical to the Turkish constitution, and therefore the Court of Cassation, the Court of Constitutional Issues in Turkey, kept banning his political parties. That said, we're going to see a number of them because they survive for a while before they're banned. And they have an incredible amount of appeal. So while you're having these conflicts between the left and the right represented by secular ultranationalists, we now have Islamists entering the fold. And you can notice that in his Oath of Miligurish, which is the name of how his organization was known internationally and the philosophy as well, that they're trying to create a new world order that is a victory for the believers, right? That the believers will prevail politically. And it's based on a number of the tenets of Islamic modernism that we've talked about in other presentations, but softened to a certain degree in order to appeal to Turkish voters who were less concerned with the particulars of the Sharia itself, and more with the ideas of spiritual strength, of expanded Turkish power, and a return of Islam to the public square where they felt like it belonged. And this also ties into the Gastarbeiter issue, because while Turkey was able to keep banning Erdoğan's parties time after time, it wasn't able to express that power internationally. And so Miligurish actually became more popular in Germany and in the Netherlands than it ever became in Turkey as an organized political entity over the long term. And you can see a Miligurish office in Kerpen, Germany. Now, last time we also talked about Cyprus, and Cyprus, of course, was a divisive issue starting in the 1960s. And when Cyprus got independence in 1960, the British wanted to maintain their naval facilities there. And so under the Cyprus constitution, both Britain, Greece, and Turkey were made guarantor powers of the independence of Cyprus. And during that time, you had a government run by Makarios III as president, and a Turkish Cypriot vice president, the second one of those being Rauf Denktaş. And both the president and the Turkish vice president had vetoes. Turkish Cypriots were also 30% of the Cypriot parliament, which is greater than their 18% share of the census. But Turkish Cypriots felt like their rights were not respected, and Greek Cypriots often felt that their rights were overrepresented. This led to a number of politically inspired clashes throughout the system. One particular one that resonates for Turks is Kanlı Noel, where over 150 Greeks and twice the number of Turks, somewhere in the 350s, were killed in political clashes from the 20th to the 21st of December in 1963, and 25,000 Turkish Cypriots, which was roughly 1/4 of all the Turkish Cypriots on the island, were forced to flee their homes and move somewhere else. You had a number of these sort of sporadic events occurring throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, with the populations of Turkey and Greece increasingly being motivated to do something about the situation. The Greek solution was enosis, the idea that Cyprus should be annexed to Greece. The Turkish populations would be allowed to stay, but of course they would be politically disempowered. The Turkish solution was what was called taksim, or division, where the island would be cut into two parts, and the Turks would be given one part and the Greeks would be given the other. neither of these solutions seemed likely to evolve on its own until you had direct Greek influence. And within Greece, there was a military dictatorship that came to power, and they prompted Nikos Samson of AOKB, a terrorist organization run by Greek Cypriots, to take power on the 15th of July, 1974. And Nikos Samson was going to engage in enosis, that union with Greece that would make Cyprus a constituent part of that country. Turkey saw this as an opportunity to implement Taksim in defense of the Turkish Cypriots, who would now be under a hostile Greek government. And they made landfall on July 20th, 1974, and moved from the northern part of the island to the southern part of the island over the course of 3 days. And after that point, the UN declared a ceasefire, which divided the island into the northern territory administered by a Turkish Cypriot government, more or less with the assistance of the Turkish government, and the south that remained independent under a Greek leadership. And of course, the British bases remained. So you end up in a situation where Turkey now has at least functional possession of the northern part of Cyprus. And North Cyprus would not become independent as the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus until 1983. So between 1974 and 1983, the area was under direct Turkish military occupation in name, as well as in function. And that Turkish military occupation forcibly expelled a significant number of Greeks from the north, and the southern zone expelled a number of Turks. And on both sides, there were allegations with significant evidence of rapes, abuses, and other sorts of attacks. But Turkey was afraid that the population of Muslims on Cyprus was insufficient to maintain the quantity of the island they had, and in the case of a peace treaty, would be insufficient to have weight in a lot of the discussions with the Greek Cypriots. And so what Turkey did is that it reached out to a number of the muhtars in Anatolia. And similar to the way that the Gastarbeiter program had recruited from populations within Anatolia, populations that were relatively uneducated and did not have access outside of the country, those muhtars were reached out to say which of their populations should be carted off to North Cyprus. And in fact, 200,000 Turks were taken from Anatolia and brought to North Cyprus. To put that in perspective, the entire population of the island was 1.1 million people. So this completely changes the demography, and these settlers have effectively become part and parcel of the northern population. Now, the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus is still defended by the Turkish military, and Turkey is the only country that recognizes the independence of the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, with most other countries continuing to see that area as militarily occupied by Turkey. In 2003, there were a number of agreements that were passed between Cyprus and the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, allowing Cypriots to cross from the Greek-administered south to the Turkish-administered north. And by Greek, I mean Greek Cypriot. One of the funny situations of Cyprus is that it became a member of the European Union in 2004. And because the government of Cyprus believes that it has de jure control over all of Cyprus, all Cypriots are entitled to European Union passports. So any Turkish Cypriot who can demonstrate Cypriot ancestry, as opposed to being an Anatolian Turk, is entitled to get a European Union passport from the south. So he has to cross the border to get his passport. Now we talk about the Kurds. So as we've mentioned before, in the 1920s and 1930s, the Kurds had were coming out of their participation to a large extent in the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, and were now shifting into a Turkey where they had made alliances with the Turks. In fact, if we remember, there was an alliance between Mahmoud Barzanji a Kurdish leader in northern Iraq, and Shafik Özdemir, one of the generals who had served with Mustafa Kemal in the War of Independence. And the goal of that was to keep Mosul and the other areas of northern Iraq outside of the British sphere of influence that would become Iraq. Kurds moved out of this alliance with Turks and into a position where they were subject to discrimination by Turks. And this discrimination came primarily from two different veins. The first one was that they were typically more religious than the Turkish population, and so many of the edicts on secularism were directly injurious to the Kurds and the Kurdish way of life. And you can see that to a certain extent in the presence of the tribal sheikhs, in the muhtars, which still exist in the Kurdish world to a much greater and more common extent than they do in the Turkish one. The other major issue, of course, is that the Republican Party policy during the years of Ataturk stressed the idea that there was only one ethnic population in Turkey, and that was the Turkish ethnic population, and that all the other ethnicities that compose the population of Turkey were themselves lies and confabulations, such that these people had been led astray from their true nature. They had been lied to about who they were, and in truth, they were Turks. They simply just didn't recognize this. And so the Kurds were renamed as Mountain Turks to acknowledge that they had a different language from the Turks, but that they were not themselves a different people. And so this resulted in a significant amount of persecution. We've talked about the Sheikh Said revolts and the Dersim rebellion in 1924 and 1937, respectively. But after that time, the Kurds sort of became swept up in many of the changes that affected Turkey through World War II and the democratization. There were a number of restrictions on Kurdish life designed to promote their mountain Turkishness. Some of those included prohibitions on their language, both in public and in private, prohibitions on schools operating in Kurdish, certain holidays not being allowed to be celebrated, and so on. And that came to a head in the 1970s. Now, we had mentioned before that you had all these communist-aligned organizations like Devrimi Gençlik, that were operating within Turkey, and a number of these organizations caught fire in the Kurdish regions. And they caught fire in the Kurdish regions specifically because these organizations spoke about inequality that the Kurds greatly aspired to. And these organizations spoke to the fundamental conservative nature of their societies. In fact, in many cases, after the Dersim revolt, many of the Kurdish tribal sheikhs and muhtars had agreed with the Turkish government and decided not to strike out on their own, not to try and resist. And so in many ways, the idea of resistance, both to the Turkish government and to the Kurdish traditional leadership that had accepted Turkish domination, was one that inspired that revolutionary zeal. Now, of course, we should point out that the PKK at no point had more than 30,000 members. At most points, it had fewer than 15,000. So of the total Kurdish population in Turkey of over 15 million, we have a low participation rate of roughly 1 in 1,000. So we have the PKK really coming to be founded on the 27th of November, 1978, as a resistance against both the Kurdish official hierarchy and the Turkish government. And that resulted in a number of terror attacks that they perpetrated against Turkish authorities, which responded in kind with increased violence, leading to the displacement of Kurds all around the country. And we're going to get into this in more detail at other points. But the number of internally displaced Kurds within Turkey is upwards of 2 million. So these are Kurds who no longer live in their historic villages, not by choice. Either their historic villages don't exist anymore, or they are not permitted to return to them. And the Turkish government began to promote the creation of forces starting in 1984 that would be designed to help the Turkish military operate within the Kurdish majority regions, primarily because those are areas that are mountainous and hard to access. And these were the Güvenlik Korucuları, or the village guards. And these village guards were made up exclusively of Kurds that were supportive of the Turkish state. They have been called by PKK and other pro-Kurdish separatist groups as groups that are traitorous to the Kurdish cause. It's worth pointing out that in many respects, these Kurdish groups that in many respects, you have Kurds who are equally as resentful of the PKK for stirring up the violence of the Turkish state, and that Kurds should simply accept that they're part of this mixture and perhaps keep their opinions sort of more to themselves. One of the changes that occurred in the 1990s with the attempted rapprochement by Turgut Özal, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is that Kurdish became legalized again. So you can see this is actually the Wilayet newspaper, which is a Kurdish newspaper. And this is their first issue from February of 1992. Kurdish was legalized as a permitted language to use in public in 1991. And another point worth making is that in the Third Republic, which starts in 1980, most minority parties had a minimum threshold of 10%. We'll discuss what that means in a second, but what that means functionally for the Kurds is that it was practically impossible for any Kurdish party to enter the parliament. The HDP really became the first Kurdish party that became accepted in the parliament and began to advocate for Kurdish rights. Of course, they have increasing problems with whatever party is dominant in power. Right now, it's the AKP. And that party will associate them as working with or supportive of or sympathetic to the PKK in order to delegitimize them both from a public perception perspective and from a functional perspective. Now, there's a question here of how much is the Turkification an extension of Ottoman irredentist imperial empire to justify modern boundaries, political, social parties, etc.? I actually don't think that Turkification is an extension of Ottoman irredentism. I think that the Turkification is part of the trauma that Turkey went through in the 1920s, where the idea that any enemies of the state, that enemies of the state could be found anywhere and in any form. And so if not all the population is Turkish, if there is diversity within the borders of the country, then it is a country that can be split apart. And so in many cases, if you look at right-wing tabloids, especially ultra-nationalist tabloids like those that the Grey Wolves would write, they would say things like, the promulgation of the Kurdish identity permits the Western powers to intervene, or permits the Soviet-aligned powers to intervene in Turkish affairs and propose cutting apart Turkey. The idea that not a single piece of Turkish land should be divided from Turkey underscores a lot of this thought process. And so rather than try and promote the idea of a multicultural Turkey where everybody's a Turkish citizen, but not everybody's an ethnic Turk, where you can have pride in the country for its human rights norms, similar to most Western democracies, the ultranationalists simply argue that such a thing would be impossible. The next part is, do the Kurds in Turkey coordinate with the Kurds in northern Iraq? That is a great question, and we're definitely going to cover that. It's very complicated. So if we go to, sorry. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to point this out because this is a particularly evocative picture. You can see they're the Turkish soldiers. This is in 1984. They've entered a Kurdish village, and you can see the Kurdish children are sitting down, as well as one at the blackboard. And he's writing, "Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene." Happy is he who believes he is a Turk, or happy is he who says, I am a Turk. It's hard to translate this phrase exactly, and there are many different translations of it. But this was a phrase given by Ataturk and is the final phrase in the oath that every student has to give in school. Think of it very similarly to the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States. So he says in this national oath, I am Turkish, honest and hardworking. My law is to protect my younger ones, to respect my elders, to love my homeland and my nation more than myself. My ideal is to ascend, to go forward. O great Ataturk, I swear that I will relentlessly strive on the path you have opened towards the goal you have shown. My existence should be a gift to the Turkish existence. How happy is he who says, I am a Turk? And so this national identity has been criticized by Kurds, especially, but also by left-wingers in general Turkish circles like Mustafa Akyol, as being the insistence that all the Turkish citizens are ethnic Turks, and that all the Turkish citizens, their goal should be something along the trajectory of Turkishness. And so forcing these Kurds to say, "Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene," how happy is he who says I am a Turk, again and again, is designed to inculcate a sense of Turkish identity in people who did not previously have it. And I want to point out one other thing about this image. If you look in the upper left-hand side, you can see a video camera. This is not something that the Turkish government did in secret or tried to hide. This is something that they were proud of. This was actually part of a propaganda film that they were putting together in the 1980s to show that they were Turkifying the Kurds, that the process of de-Kurdification, of unification under Turkish identity was happening as part of the Turkish state's growth and identity. So you can understand the mentality of the Turks who are creating this. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. And I have a comment here that basically says that in a strange way, Turkey has an identity similar to the Prussian Germany of the 1870s to 1900s. And it's like, and yes, it very much does. It has this sort of militaristic state. So we start moving in the direction of the coup of 1980. And several things should already be glaringly unsurprising, let's say. We have increasing violence perpetrated by both the Demirel, which is the newest incarnation of the revolutionary path, the left-wing groups. In fact, one of the members of the Devrimciyol is Taner Akçam, who is very famous for his research into the Armenian genocide, which he performs in Boston, because, of course, his work would be illegal in Turkey. And the right-wing groups led by Alparslan Türkeş. In fact, Türkeş's Grey Wolves were responsible for the massacre at the city of Maraş in 1978, which killed hundreds of individuals. In fact, the clashes between the left wing and the right wing claimed by the end of 1980 over 5,000 Turkish citizens, the immense amount of fighting in the streets. And NATO even argued that they might get involved to bring peace into Turkey, which was why the Grey Wolves fought so hard in many, put out the communists, at least in their view, in order to prevent NATO from getting involved. We also have, but the clashes between the left and the right were not the immediate concern of the governing of the military. The military's primary concern was, at least they stated this because the coup occurred only a few days afterwards, was that the National Salvation Party, which was a party headed by Necmettin Erbakan, one of these Islamist parties that he created, began a protest in Konya. And you can even see that their flag is in Arabic, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, right? There is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet, which is very strange for a Turkish protest because almost all Turkish protests, they protest in Turkish. And you have this situation where the military is worried that Iran, which has recently promulgated the constitution of the Islamic Republic, will support an Islamist uprising in Turkey and therefore derail the country from its pro-Western Republican axis. This, combined with a crash in remittances, meant the country was desperately poor. And the crash in remittances was due to the fact that a lot of the industrialized world experienced a setback in the 1970s, which was the Arab oil embargo. Right, so with limited oil, they couldn't produce as much. They couldn't hire as many people. The Turks in Germany couldn't send back as much money because they needed it for themselves. So you have poor people who are angry and killing each other, and the possibility arises of an Islamist takeover, at least in the minds of the military. And so you have a situation where Kenan Evren, who was a colonel in the military, leads a coup d'etat and is successful in 1980. Now, unlike the coup of Cemal Gürsel, this military takeover is incredibly brutal. It's estimated that 100,000 Turks of different stripes, from the left, from the right, but mostly from the left, were tortured, beaten, sent to concentration camps. Many were disappeared. Some, and many more we know, died. This is actually an exhibit from Ankara, Turkey, that existed maybe about 10 years ago, called the Museum of Shame, where you can see a face on each of these placards. Each of these placards represents one person who was tortured or disappeared or otherwise killed by the military regime under Kenan Evren after the coup of 1980 and the dissolution of the Second Republic. There's a question here of Greece and Turkey did population exchanges, and many Western Turks are actually of Greek descent. Perhaps Turkey's techniques for assimilation to a Turkish identity are not universally embraced. I would say when it comes to the Muhajir, the Turks who come from immigration, be it Greek, Albanian, Bosnian, Circassian, Laz, Bulgarian, Pomak, all these kinds of groups, they tend to be more assimilationist than those groups that are indigenous to Turkey. Because those groups that are indigenous to Turkey have their own longstanding culture that was not subject to being uprooted and having to resettle. So that's part of the reason. And so we have the creation of the Third Republic. So the Third Republic did away with a lot of the checks and balances that had existed in the Second Republic. Kenan Evren did not like the idea of an independent Supreme Court necessarily, but he permitted it. The state radio media and the universities were put back under the control of the Grand National Assembly, primarily because those were the sources of leftism, and Evren was strongly opposed to leftism. And of course, the military was made dominant above all, with the ability to send memoranda to the democratic government under the new 1982 constitution. Now, the 1982 constitution is still the constitution that is in effect. However, it has been amended something close to 30 times since its initial promulgation and is very different now than it was then. And we'll talk about some of those amendments as we go forward. We then move into the 1980s, which are presided over by Turgut Özal. And Özal is a particularly interesting character for a few different reasons. The first one is that he is the first Turkish prime minister who is not entirely Turkish. He is mixed, half Kurdish and half Turkish, and that can explain some of his attempts at conciliation with the Kurds that we'll sort of talk about in a bit. Another interesting thing about him is that unlike the leaders of the 1960s and 70s, he came from an economic background. In fact, he was the chief financier after Kenan Evren took over the government. And the reason this is important is that, as I mentioned, the remittances to Turkey had plunged. The Turkish economy was in free fall at this point, and they needed somebody who would standardize the system and make it possible for Turkey to be making money again. And Özel was actually able to do that. So you have a situation where his party, the Motherland Party, continues to be elected. And the Motherland Party is pretty much a hodgepodge of everyone. He had liberals in the party, he had conservatives in the party, he had nationalists, he had Islamists. He had a variety of different people in the party, and keeping the coalition together on any particular issue was probably his toughest job. And eventually the Motherland Party lost, not so much because it ran out of steam, but because its parts had fissioned off into different pieces. Another interesting thing about Özal's leadership was that it was during his leadership that the closest rapprochements with Armenia really started. We can talk also about the Zurich protocols, and we will, that took place in 2009. But Özal was one of the first Turkish leaders to start talking about the difficult acts that Turkey had committed. Of course, he did not use the term genocide to describe them, but he did talk about reconciliation with Armenia and perhaps reconciliation with the Armenian diaspora, right? Remember, Armenia is not an independent country at this point until later in his administration in 1991. But he couldn't make real change with regards to dealing with Armenia because at the same time, the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, or Asala, a terrorist organization, began operating in Turkey and assassinating Turkish bureaucrats, among other things. And any rapprochement that he made with Armenia in any noticeable way would have completely delegitimized him as a leader of Turkey, given the actions of Asala. One last thing to mention about the 1980s, which are a relatively stable decade in Turkish history, surprisingly, was the Aegean crisis of 1987. And this is when the Greeks were drilling for oil off of an island in the Aegean called Thassos. And the Turks were afraid that it would be close to Turkish waters. And there was a military standoff between the Greeks and the Turks. But Özal was actually the first one to back off the standoff a little bit, saying that he would not fire until the Greeks fired first, which made it very easy for the Greeks to say, we're not firing on them. And the crisis dissipated. Now, there was a question earlier about whether or not the Kurds in Iraq coordinate with the Kurds in Turkey. And this goes back to the question of how did the Kurds in Iraq sit? And we've discussed this on the Iraqi side, that in the 1990s, the United States was now in a quasi-occupation of Iraq following the Persian Gulf War. And Iraq north of the 36th parallel was subject to a no-fly zone, which covered most of the Kurdish majority regions of Iraq. So that effectively meant that the Kurdish regions had autonomy. And you then had the struggle between the KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, and the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And these two parties fought a civil war starting in 1994 and continuing until a Washington-mediated peace in 1998. But what does this mean for the Kurds in Turkey? Well, the KDP tended to be more conservative politically, and the PUK tended to be a little bit more socialist politically. So the PKK, which was the Kurdish militia operating in Turkey, found more in common with the PUK than they did with the KDP. And a number of PUK units relocated to PUK territory. So thank you, Aaron, for saying that you were in Operation Provide Comfort. It's really nice to know that people's experiences actually connect with what I'm talking about. And so you have the PKK operating alongside the PUK in the civil war against the KDP, which naturally meant that the KDP turned to the Turkish government and began having discussions with them, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in fact, the Turkish government actually sent tanks and artillery across the border into Iraq to fight the PUK and the PKK on Iraqi soil, without ever declaring war on the government of Saddam Hussein. But that's not all the Turkish government did with regards to the Kurds, certainly not those Kurds in Turkey proper. As I mentioned before, the Turkish government, especially during the 1980s, engaged in a large-scale depopulation. And in fact, over 3,000 Kurdish villages were completely depopulated, or depopulated to the point where they had no long-term future. And Kurdish migration occurred all throughout the country, with many Kurds fleeing to the north or to the west into the large-scale cities, where they became an urban poor. And this war that Turkey fought against its own population ended up costing roughly 40,000 people, most of whom were killed by Turkish forces, some of whom were killed by PKK militants. And as I mentioned before, left 2 million Kurds displaced or dispossessed. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani, the leaders of the KDP and the PUK, respectively. So we should also talk about the relationship that Syria has with all of this Kurdish convulsion, which is to say that President Hafez Assad, who had been in power since 1970, was one of those Syrians who felt that the Turkish annexation of Hatay region in 1938 was a violation of Syrian sovereignty, and therefore rejected the Turkish right to control it. This, combined with Özal's attempt to build dams in the southeast of Anatolia, which was part of Özal's energy project, in order to bring jobs and development to the southeastern part of Anatolia, areas close to where the Kurds lived. Hafez al-Assad refused to have good relations with the Turks for the first part of his leadership, and in fact allowed the PKK to build schools in Lebanon, because remember, Syria occupied Lebanon in the 1980s, and allowed Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, to live in Syria. And that arrangement continued until 1998, when Turkey and Syria began to normalize their relations. And part of that normalization was Syria's ejection of Öcalan, where he later fled from country to country before being captured in Kenya and being deported to Turkey, where he is still in a Turkish jail. It's not surprising, of course, therefore, that the Kurdish organizations that proliferate in Syria today are in many cases related to the PKK, as opposed to being connected to the KDP or any other Kurdish organization that Turkey might be more amenable to working with. And then we get to the 1990s. Turkey in the 1990s was an absolute mess. And there are a few reasons for that. The first is that increasingly, as the Kurdish conflict was escalating, there began to be resentment led by Özal and a number of generals like Eşref Bitlis, Bahtiyar Aydın, and Cem Ersever towards the brutalization of Turkey's own population by its government, and that a peaceful settlement with the Kurds of some kind, perhaps a degree of autonomy, especially since the PKK had begun to limit their goals as we entered the 90s, from full-scale independence to regional autonomy. But all four of those individuals, Prime Minister Özel, as well as all three of those generals, died in the year 1993. It's been called the so-called coup or the secret coup because each of them died under mysterious circumstances. Özal died of food poisoning. Eşref Bitlis died in a plane crash. Bahtiyar Aydın was killed by PKK, even though the PKK claimed that they didn't touch him. And Cem Ersever, I forget how he was killed. But in each case, none of them died natural deaths, and all of them happened to die in the exact same calendar year, opening the way for a new leader to take the prime ministry, and that would be Tansu Çiller. Tansu Çiller was Turkey's first female prime minister, and she showed her immense empathy and personal growth, as we would expect from a female leader, by intensifying the war against the Kurds. There had been discussion among the Directorate of Generals about intensifying the war, but those actions were tabled by Bitlis and Özal in the early 90s as a way to seek rapprochement with the Kurds. With her being firmly in control, Çiller decided to move more directly against the Kurdish population. We also see the collaboration between Tansu Çiller and the European Union. This is really the first time that the European Union really comes into the picture. Now, Özal had applied for membership in 1987, but the membership application didn't really go anywhere until Çiller began to go to Brussels starting in 1994, and she managed to get the EU to agree to a customs union, which increased Turkish-European trade by over 40% and helped to improve the Turkish economy, at least during the first few years of her presidency, of her prime ministry. There's a question as to why they all died or how they all died within the same year. I believe that there was a Turkish deep state that felt that any rapprochement with the Kurds, which is what those three generals and Özal were suggesting, would be the death of the Turkish state. And so they found ways to slip them these materials. Remember, these are individuals within the Turkish government. There's no court trial that would prove it, but a lot of these things sort of came out later in terms of the controversy and the suspicion. So it could well be that all of the people who endorsed a peaceful resolution with the Kurds died in the same year. And coincidentally, Özal died about a week before he was going to present his full-blown plan for instructing the military on how to deal with the Kurds, so that way they could achieve a peace process. So take that as you will. At this point, the Turkish government became more and more affiliated with a number of different mafia organizations. In particular, they began to have connections with Abdullah Çatlı, who was a Turkish mafioso, in order to create more street fighters that would harass both Kurdish and Turkish targets. The extent of this is not known, but we do know that these kinds of conversations were quite common due to the Susurluk incident. This is a case where there was a car in Susurluk, it got into a traffic accident, and 4 individuals in the car died. But what's interesting is who those individuals were. You had one minister of parliament, you had Çatlı himself, who was a mafioso, you had a journalist, you had a number of different individuals that would show that there was some degree of connection, some degree of conversation And the Susurluk incident greatly diminished Chiler's appeal in the wider Turkish public because of the appearance of being involved with organized crime. One of the sort of strange occurrences that happened during this period in the 90s was that once Özal had passed and Chiler became prime minister, Süleyman Demirel became the president. Now, the president under the Third Turkish Republic, at least under the 1982 constitution as existed at this time, is a very weak position, very similar to the Queen of England or the President of Israel, for those of you who are familiar with that political system, where the role of the president is to choose the prime minister and to ask them to organize a coalition. So he appointed Tansu Çiller, and she made her coalition the first time. In 1995, she lost an election. She lost the majority hold that she would need, and she would need a coalition partner. Into this steps the Welfare Party or the Virtue Party, depending on what name Erbakan was using at the time. And this created an alliance between an Islamist party under Erbakan and Çiller, meaning that this was the first time the Islamists were actually part of the governing coalition in name as well as in function. And of course, as a secularizing influence, the military was not particularly happy with this. So in 1997, they launched what was called the postmodern coup. And it's called that because they literally just sent a memorandum to the government saying, there is a coup now, you're all removed from power. And the threat of the military power was enough that you actually didn't need the tanks on the streets. Necmettin Erbakan was removed from power and banned from politics for 5 years, and his party was banned as well. What's interesting to note at this point is that there was a junior member of his Virtue Party named Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, who was mayor of Istanbul, who was also banished from politics for 5 years, but took the opportunity to learn that there are some differences that he should hold relative to Erbakan in terms of how an Islamist party should govern. There are also some wider points that we should make about the latter part of the 1990s. As we move away from Tansu Çiller's government and towards sort of a rocky interim that will get us to 2003 in the AKP. The first one is that the economy was horrendously bad in the later 90s. And you can see in the graph that at no point in the 1990s was inflation lower than 60% throughout the entirety of the 1990s. And it got to the point where Turkey was issuing notes for millions of Turkish lira. And to put into context, 1 million Turkish lira was worth about 60 cents, I think, US, something about there, in 1998. So it's actually surprising how long the inflation was and how it never really jumped above, let's say, 115%. Because usually if you have inflation, it soars very quickly. But for some reason in Turkey, it didn't. But it did make the currency very unstable and very undesirable for foreign investors, which is why you can see throughout the 1990s that FDI was practically zero throughout the entirety of the decade. The IMF was then involved in improving the economy through forced changes to Turkey's development, both in 1997 and again in 2001. And you can see after those changes have been implemented, the FDI in Turkey rises dramatically. And in fact, the early 2000s until the financial crash around the world in 2008 were very prosperous from a Turkish economic perspective. And the Turkish economy recovered by 2011, and it would continue, and then it would suffer, as we know, towards the latter half of the 2010s. There's a question here about when did Turkey join NATO? That was in 1952 under the Democrats. So The other major development in Turkey during the 1990s, which should be remembered for all of its difficulty, is the Izmit earthquake and the following Düzce earthquake, both of which took place in 1999, one in August, the other in November. These activities are along a Turkish fault line, which runs very close to Istanbul. And these quakes together were responsible for around 18,000 deaths, and over $5 billion to $10 billion, depending on whose estimates you use, in property damage, affecting cities like Izmit, of course, which was the epicenter, but also cities that are further away, like Bursa and Istanbul. In this particular picture, the woman who's crying has just seen her 16-year-old brother's corpse being excavated by the team behind her. And so when we move into 2003, we enter into a new period, which is Erdoğanism. And Erdoğanism is a unique political philosophy. Now, we've seen to a certain degree Erbakanism, that sort of Islamism that is based on the replacement of the official law of Turkey with the Sharia. But Erdoğan realized that this became the recurring reason why the Turkish Supreme Court kept kept killing all of sorry, let me just check something. All right. So Erdoğan decided that he was going to focus on Islam as a cultural element as opposed to a political element. And so he's not going to make any laws that explicitly refer to the Sharia, but he will do everything short of that. So he's going, and we're going to see what Islam in society looks like under him. Now, Erdoğan also decides to base his legitimacy, at least in the first half of his time in office, on his economic success. And as I pointed out, with a significant foreign direct investment under the direction of the International Monetary Fund, none of those policies being Erdoğan's himself, he manages to preside over an economy that is growing and developing and is increasingly becoming integrated into the European Union. And so from 2002 onward, the AK party, the Freedom and Justice Party, came to power. Now, there's a question of, do you think Erdoğan is trying to become a dictator or Islamic nationalist? I think he already is a dictator. And I don't think that he's trying to become any particular ideologue. I think he's just sort of trying to figure out within sort of an Islamic cultural milieu if he can become the most powerful person and then expand that power through neo-Ottomanism. I don't think he has a particular idea of how to implement the Sharia that he would like anyway. And so during the AK period, we're going to talk about just general themes that begin to occur. So the first one, of course, is the relationship between Armenia and Turkey. Now, Armenia became independent, as we mentioned, in 1989. In 1988 to 1991, as the Soviet Union was falling apart. And the Turkish position during the First Nagorno-Karabakh War between Armenia and Azerbaijan was primarily neutral. The one thing that Turkey did, which was to close the border. And since 1982, the border between Turkey and Armenia has been closed to all human and customs traffic. So that way, the Armenian economy the Armenians are effectively blockaded on their two largest sides, only having the north to Georgia and the south to Iran open to them. You also have Armenian questions about their role in Turkey. And probably the most difficult question on this was the author Hrant Dink. Hrant was an ethnic Armenian who was a Turkish citizen, and he wrote on the question of the genocide very often, as well as on Turkish Armenian situations more broadly. He consistently used the word and pointed out that the Turks have to come to a recognition of what had happened. But at the same time, he argued that the genocide issue shouldn't be political, and the attempt to make genocide recognition sort of a litmus test of pro-Turkey relations or anti-Turkey relations, and attempts by Armenians to try and get it recognized in other countries was counterproductive to the development of peaceful relations between Armenians and Turks. He famously said, for example, that the Kurds are being deceived by the Americans and by the French and by the British and all these other groups that pretend to care about their independence, because as soon as they get what they want, they're going to leave, and the Kurds and the Turks will be inflamed in conflict, because they already live right next to each other. The Armenians and the Turks live near each other. They need to be able to relate to one another on their own terms without foreign meddling in the matter. Despite such a complicated opinion, there were many who were critical of him, and he was prosecuted under Article 301 of the Turkish Constitution, which is a law against Turkishness, which is the law that you are not allowed to insult Turkishness. It's not clear what any of that means, but he was found guilty of doing it several times. He was eventually assassinated by Ogun Samast, who you can see in that picture, on the 19th of January, 2007. In a fitting show, which demonstrates how controversial Hrant Dink was, the police officers actually took a staged photo with Ogun Samast after they arrested him, showing their support for his ultra-nationalist Turkish position, which was why he killed Hrant Dink. That said, those officers shouldn't speak for the majority of the Turkish population. Tens of thousands of people showed up at Hrant Dink's funeral, which took place on the 23rd of January, and you can see the Istanbul streets entirely clogged with people who were chanting on Hrant Dink's behalf, and that they basically saying like I am an Armenian kind of thing. So you have this sort of massive division that exists between how Turks see each other and how Turks see reconciliation possibly with Armenia. And the closest that Turkey and Armenia got to reconciliation during the AKP period was the Zurich Protocols, which were signed in October of 2009 and were designed to liberalize the relationship, possibly end the blockade, start moving towards economic and cultural alignment, and perhaps even eventually genocide recognition. But despite signing the Zurich Protocols, both of these individuals, Davutoglu and Nalbandian, when they returned back to their respective capitals, didn't find much support in the legislatures to approve them. And by 2018, the Armenian government had officially withdrawn from the protocols. They had never been implemented, despite attempts by Turkey and Armenia to develop that relationship, at least nominally. One of the difficult points in Armeno-Turkish relations today is that a number of Armenians have left Armenia to come work in Turkey. There are estimates of between 100,000 and 150,000 Armenians who are living and working in Turkey. And they are called by the Erdoğan government as illegal immigrants. Many of them have come without papers. The term may well seem apt, but this is one of those cases where the idea of Armenians existing, especially in the eastern part of Turkey, which had been a historic part of Armenia, Armenians call it Western Armenia for that reason, as illegal immigrants when literally the border crossed them and they were pushed out through a genocide, comes off as rather insensitive, at least. And so these kinds of conversations permeate through the Turkish media about how should we deal with the illegal Armenian immigrants? Can they be a part of Turkey? Should they be in Turkey? All of these kinds of questions. And for many of the Armenians, they would return back to Armenia in a heartbeat. if it were the case that they could get a job that paid as well as the ones that they find in Turkey. We also see Turkey having an orientation to promote a growing Turkic world. Of course, the closest alliance that Turkey has is with Azerbaijan. In fact, the Turks have said that Turkey and Azerbaijan are one people, two countries, and the Turks assisted Azerbaijan mightily in the Second Karabakh War, which took place in November of 2020, where the Azerbaijanis were able to retake the historic capital of Karabakh, which was Shusha, from the Armenian Nagorno-Karabakh country, the country of Artsakh. And Turkey's main contribution to the war was twofold. They provided drones. Turkish drone technology is increasingly a desired export. In fact, Turkish military drones have been used in the Ukraine war as well, on the Ukrainian side. And in the case of Azerbaijan, Turkey is accused of deploying jihadist militants on the Azerbaijani side against Armenian forces. The Turks claim that they are not responsible for the presence of those jihadists. So you have two sides of that coin, but the drones they do admit are their own. The Azerbaijanis also used Israeli drones in the prosecution of the war against Armenia, as Azerbaijan and Israel have very strong relations. But Turkey's interest in promoting unity and fraternity among Turkish peoples doesn't just extend to Azerbaijan, although that relationship is certainly the strongest. They convened the Turkic Council, which eventually became the Organization of Turkic States in 2009, with its capital in Istanbul. The capital of the organization is in Istanbul, and it includes all of the former Soviet Stan countries, except Turkmenistan is an observer state, and Tajikistan is not a Turkic country. It has a Persian population, so it's not included. And the point of the Organization of Turkic States is to improve diplomatic, political, economic, and social cooperation between Turkey and the other Turkic states. And in fact, that has been the case. Trade has increased over 30% between the partners, especially between Turkey and Kazakhstan. And increasingly, Turkey has developed soft power in the region. One other piece that's worth noting is that Turkey's coordination with Azerbaijan to link the two countries. The first major linkage, of course, was the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, Ceyhan being a coastal city in southern Turkey, so that oil from Baku can be shipped anywhere in the world. And the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railroad, which was finally completed in 2017, although it's primarily used for freight at this point. The irony of the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railroad is that it was completely unnecessary. There already is a railroad connection between Gyumri in Armenia and Kars in Turkey. And the railroad in Armenia connects to railroads in Azerbaijan because those were all built during the Soviet period. However, in order for those railroads to run, Azerbaijan and Armenia would have to not be at war, and Armenia and Turkey would have to not have a blockade. So rather than make peaceful overtures in order to try and create some semblance of working together, they spent a significant amount of money to route a new train line through Georgia to connect the two countries. We also move into Turkish politics again, and Erdoğan began to move against the military starting in 2008 with what was known as the Ergenekon trials. Ergenekon was a supposed conspiracy between different military leaders. Turkish courts in 2016, in the Turkish Court of Cassation, argued that no evidence sufficient to prove the existence of such a conspiracy had ever been presented in all the previous 8 years of trials. Nevertheless, over 270 individuals from the Turkish military had been were removed from their positions under the law and tried in connection with Ergenekon. Now, the conspiracy was supposedly to undo the democratic nature of the Turkish state, which doesn't sound terribly strange from what we've seen before, with the military consistently trying to undermine democracy in Turkey, at least when that democracy seems to violate the principles of Kemalism. But as I pointed out with the Turkish Court of Cassation, there's never been any evidence that shows that they were working together on this, that they were planning a specific coup at a specific time or in a specific place. And in fact, much of the testimony came from individuals associated with what was called the Hizmet movement. The Hizmet movement being a social Islamic movement led by Fethullah Gülen. This movement is also called the Gülenist movement because of Gülen's influence. And in many cases, the role previously held by the military was now inherited by the Hizmet movement. And the military had been permanently defanged during this period. It's worth pointing out that from the European Union perspective, the Ergenekon trials looked positive. They occurred alongside a number of a number of amendments, 26 amendments that were voted on through a single referendum in September of 2010 that would limit the power of the military. And of course, from the Copenhagen criteria, which are the criteria necessary to enter the European Union, having a weakened military that is subservient to the civilian government is part of the criteria, as well as a number of freedoms with regard to labor, such as the right for labor unions to assemble and workers to petition for better wages, freedoms of expression and journalism. All of these changes were positive from a European perspective and showed that Turkey was interested in incorporating itself from the European Union. The other way of looking at this was that these attempts strengthened labor, strengthened the population, and weakened the military, which exactly would put the military, Erdogan's biggest rival, out of power. And of course, the judiciary was structured in such a way under these referenda to be much more dependent on the Grand National Assembly, which would weaken the judiciary power to overturn Atatürk. It's unsurprising, therefore, if you look at the voting results, that areas that were solidly conservative historically, those that were AKP voting regions, tended to vote in favor of the measure, indicated by dark blue, and those that were opposed to these reforms generally were in Republican regions that had generally seen the military as their protectors, like the coastal regions in Izmir or Edirne, and so on, indicated by the tan color. Now, I mentioned Islam in public and Islam in wider society, so it's worth unpacking a little bit about what that is. Erdogan never actually implemented legal Sharia. He learned his lesson from Erbakan that you can't do that, or else you'll have all 6 of your political parties banned and you'll be expelled from politics. What he managed to do was to work within the system and promote things that would move people socially in a more conservative way. In 2008, he passed what was called the Hijab Amendment, which was designed to permit women, especially in university campuses, to continue to be allowed to wear the hijab. And so the hijab could become a part of public consumption in Turkey. In fact, his wife, Erme, who you can see there, is a hijab-wearing woman. As part of a European Union initiative, Erdogan also presided over the Istanbul Convention, which was a convention designed to combat violence against women and other sexual harassment, which was particularly notable in Turkey. And so his commitment here was seen positively. The reason why it's part of Islam in society is that Erdogan actually withdrew from the Istanbul Convention in 2021, citing religious objections to the continued enforcement of these laws that would protect women against marital assaults and similar. In fact, it was argued in 2011, with the statistics at hand, that 38% of Turkish women were in some way sexually or emotionally abused by their husbands. We also had attempts to change the education system. Probably the most famous are what are called the Imam Hatip schools. These were developed at first during the Democrat period and enhanced during the Second Republic period. These are schools that were designed to be religious vocational schools. Now, remember, of course, in Turkey, you have a religious ministry called the Diyanet. And the Diyanet, where all the imams are trained and then sent to the various mosques around the country to create religious homogeneity. So the Imam Hatip schools were designed to teach imams and other similar religious individuals who would be part of the government or part of the religious ministry what the Quran says and how to read it, almost like a vocational school to be a preacher. Attendance at these schools waxed and waned. There were questions about whether it violated secularism or not, the extent to which, but in the early days, you could not go from an Imam Hatip school to a university because a university required a general education. But Imam Hatip schools tried to overcome this by including secular curricula in its ambit, and these schools were enhanced and expanded by Erdoğan by an order of magnitude. So instead of around 50,000 students going, which was about what it was when he assumed power, there are now 1.8 million students going. And in these schools, as well as in the traditional Turkish curriculum, you begin to see a shift towards promoting certain Islamic themes in the education system. Probably the most prevalent of these is the removal or limiting of evolution in school textbooks and replacing it with a theory of Islamic creationism. An Islamic theory of creationism, which is basically the same as creationism that exists in the United States, but replace the word God with Allah, and you're pretty much there. One particularly strong exponent of Islamic creationism is Adnan Oktar, who has his own unique cult. It's entirely separate from Sunni Islam or the power that Erdoğan wields. But in his cult, he promotes quite strongly Islamic creationism. Another aspect that gets more presence in Turkish textbooks is the concept of jihad and the idea of religious struggle against inequality. So two other things that I want to point out here is that he began to do attacks on alcohol. You can see this was back in 2021. Erdoğan closed forbade all shops to sell alcohol during Ramadan. And you can see this is a store that says that it's unable to sell the alcohol on its shelves. In Turkey today, that has been rescinded. But alcohol has been constrained, and you can only buy it between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. from a store. Restaurants can serve it after that point. But these curfews are designed to make it more difficult to acquire alcohol, which of course is against Islamic morals. And another form of morality that is becoming increasingly common is that the Radio ve Televizyon Üst Kurulu, or Artuk, which is the equivalent of the FCC in Turkey. It's an organization that monitors the communications on television and so forth, has begun to engage in modesty censorship in order to prevent Turks from seeing scenes that may, from an Islamic sensibility, be too immodest. So you can see in each of these realms, aspects of Islam are expanded, laws are put in place, or culture or shifted around in such a way to expand the role of Islam in the public sphere, but in no case is the Sharia itself directly implemented. None of the laws are defended on the grounds of Sharia. They're defended on other grounds, such as modesty or cultural sensitivity, or the specialness of Ramadan, or something like that. That's more nebulous and more hard to pin down than it says in the Sharia to do X. And we start moving into a new round of threats that Erdoğan was facing. As a result of the freedom of expression that he had created under the 2010 amendments, you began to have protests. And one particular protest was over Gezi Park. Now, Gezi Park was an area of greenery in Istanbul that was going to be replaced with some construction. And there was a small protest about it that was designed to stop that change. But when the police began to interact with the Gezi Park protesters, the protest morphed into a collection of all of the different grievances that people generally had against the Turkish government, including its general lack of freedoms and permissions. The Gezi Park protest was probably the apogee of democratic presence in Turkey, because the military quashed the protest in Istanbul itself, and the protest that had spread to other regions, in fact, it existed in over 500 different localities throughout Turkey, began to wither away and die once the main protest was put down by the police on the 20th of August. Now, the next real threat that Erdoğan saw was from Fethullah Gülen. Now, you remember that Gülen actually assisted him during the Ergenekon trials, especially from 2008 to 2016. But because of that, many of the individuals from the Gülenist organization had replaced the military in various points of the hierarchy, and Gülen was now, in theory, a possible threat to Erdoğan, considering how much power he now wielded. And so Erdoğan was looking for a way to remove Gülen from power. Now, there's a debate as to whether the coup that occurred in 2016, the attempted coup that occurred on 16th of July of that year, was a real coup or not. My contention is that it wasn't, that it was a false coup, but it could have easily been something similar to Talat Aydemir's coup, where simply not enough of the military were signed in to the prospect. It could also be that because of how weakened the military was because of the Ergenekon trials, that they didn't even have enough power to execute a coup, even if they had wanted to, and they did want to. But regardless of whether you think the coup was staged or not, the reactions that Erdoğan had seemed very staged. When the coup was put down, and it was put down by popular protest as well as by its lack of strength, it only really erupted in Ankara and Istanbul. What ended up happening is that he had a list of all the Gülenists in the government, or suspected Gülenists in the government, and the next day they all lost their jobs, from high-level bureaucrats to the post officers in rural towns. You had journalists who began to be arrested, starting with Gezi Park, but continuing onwards. Turkey has been one of the worst places to be a journalist, certainly in the OECD world, if not the world more broadly. And this has continued, especially if those journalists report on political affairs. In fact, Turkey has generally, year by year, arrested more journalists than China has, to give you an idea about how bad the climate is. And of course, Erdoğan has lists of these journalists that he wishes to remove. One of the things that kept Turkey stable during the 2016 coup was that, for some reason, the military commanders did not shut off the internet. One of the reasons why I think that the coup was not a real coup, but that's beside the point. And using the internet, Erdoğan was able to address the people through FaceTime, and then that was broadcast on mainstream television, basically telling the provocateurs that they should stand down, and that he would get the rest of the army to put them down if they wouldn't submit to civilian rule. Now, the biggest way that Turkey saw to get rid of Erdoğan saw to get rid of these threats was to amend the constitution in April of 2017. The amendments that he worked on in conjunction with the MHP, we'll get into that party next time, I guess, were designed in order to remove the prime minister as the primary leader of the country and create a strong president, much more similar to the United States, where the president has an incredible amount of executive power, can issue executive orders, can actually run the affairs of government, and the parliament is basically a lawmaking body that the president will defer to once in a while. And those constitutional amendments did pass. The referendum did pass, and so he has all of that power. And since we're at the witching hour, we will talk about all of these other issues next week. So questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. And in the meantime, I will look. Oh, that's interesting. So this is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard, and you have been here. Next week we will finish finally with Turkey, and then we will go on, as I said, to the Caucasus region, and then we will discuss on the following week about the Afghanistan situation since 1970. And you can see all of our different series. You can also see that we have some short-range series like the Russo-Ukrainian War. And of course, you are more than free to look at our older series that are all up there on our YouTube channel. So a few comments that are here that are worth talking about. Between Europe and Turkey, are we at a clash of civilizations when it comes to female embodiment? I don't think we are, actually. I think that the question is much more between conservatives and liberals, regardless of where they live. There are Bosnian women and Albanian women who wear kerchiefs as well. Muslims more than Christians, but there are Christians who do it too. Like if you go to Greece, also the older women wear these kinds of kerchiefs. And spousal abuse and other things tends to be more of a north-south dichotomy in Europe than I think a religious dichotomy in Europe. So I think that if Turkey is ruled by somebody who is more secular in their approach and more left in their social orientation, let's say, Turkey could easily become a country on the level of other Southern European countries or other Eastern European countries in terms of its level of female empowerment. So I don't really see it as a Europe and Turkey situation, but as long as the AKP is in power, there will be an increasing gulf between the way women are going to be viewed in Turkey and the way they're going to be viewed in Europe, because Europe is moving towards the left and the AKP is drawing Turkey socially towards the right. There's a point here that it was the Wahhabism movement from Saudi Arabia that funded extremism in Pakistan, such as Kissinger's funding of the ISI and carpet bombing Bangladesh, which explains why we never won the war on terror. Yes, I would say that the Wahhabism movement from Saudi Arabia has funded extremism in Pakistan, certainly. But the winning of the war on terror is difficult because there's no real goal that seems to be at all quantifiable. And that's sort of the point. If the argument is that there will never be terrorism again, that genie's simply out of the bottle. The functional issue with terrorism is that we live in a world where it's very easy to acquire weapons that deal a great amount of damage. So you don't need to be a large-scale operator to perform terror. And because of modern technology in terms of videography and photography, a small act of violence can be exported everywhere, which threatens everyone and therefore has outsized impact. So I don't think you can put that back in the bottle. If you're talking about destabilizing regimes that promote terrorism and installing new regimes, I don't think that we could win the war on terror unless we're willing to commit, and by we meaning any country that wants to participate in the war on terror, we are willing to commit the troops to actually stabilize the country in the long term. It's very similar to, for example, how the US occupied Japan and in Germany for decades. In fact, our troops haven't left Germany or Japan in order to ensure that they would have a stable government. But the problem is that the American people don't want forever wars. So If that's the case, then there's no possible way to win the war on terror. If the goal is to remove terror supporting regimes. And yes, Afghanistan is absolutely the graveyard of empires. Thank you, Sophia, for the kind words, as well as you, Brad. I'm glad that you guys enjoy this. All right, are there any other questions? Does anybody want to speak? All right. Um, so I'm glad that that people are enjoying the series, and I will see everybody next week then, if there are no further questions. All right, bye.